A lot of the well, not a lot. There was like a few things that I wanted to talk about over the past couple days, but those have been rendered like kind of inconsequential by comparison. When you compare it to the ginormous student protests that are happening all across the United States. In fact, I guess I'll just open with that since it's in the title of the stream, and I guess I'm not going to get a better opportunity to talk about it. So, here and there have been protests about the situation in Palestine. People protesting against the Israeli government and against the United States government for supporting them. Uh, Chants of free Palestine from the river to the sea. We don't support genocide and all that. But recently there was a protest at Columbia University that was subject to a little thing that we like to call the Streisand effect. Now, if you're not familiar, the Streisand effect is basically what happens when there's some information or something that's relatively inconvenient if it were to be widespread. So, a government or whatever group tries to suppress that information. But as a product of suppressing it, it only becomes more widespread because now the suppressing of that information or that movement or whatever is the news story. That's kind of what happened at Columbia University. There were protesters that were doing a encampment on campus. They pitched tents and all that in order to protest the genocide in Gaza. And the campus, the administration, the college administration called the cops on them, and the cops showed up and did the typical thing that cops do. That is cracking people's skulls. They beat up the protesters and tried to forcibly remove them from the encampment. This, in turn, prompted many, many other universities to protest in solidarity with Columbia to such an extent that now there are so many universities across the United States protesting that I legitimately would not be able to name them all. There are dozens and dozens of universities that are currently embroiled in student protests against the genocide in the Gaza Strip right now, paralleling some of the civil rights demonstrations and anti-war demonstrations in the Vietnam era. In fact, the police being called in to brutalize protesters also echoes some of the things that were happening back in those days as well. With some people speculating that if somebody armed with like proper guns shows up, that this could lead to another Kent State massacre type of situation. Thankfully, we haven't gotten there yet, to my knowledge. But things are already pretty bad. There's tear gas being used at some of these protests. There's, obviously police are brutalizing protesters, which includes the faculty at these universities as well. I've seen footage of cops using rubber bullets. So it's, the cops have definitely escalated things, but not quite to the point of killing people. Not yet, at least. And of course, as is the case with every single protest movement in history, there are also a lot of liberals that are very interested in hen-pecking and being, kind of hand-wringing from the sidelines about, oh, well, in theory, we support what you guys are doing, but you're being very loud and uncivil about it, so, we don't like it. But they need be paid no heed, like, at all. I don't know what's going to come of this. I honestly don't. It's been the case in recent history that massive protest movements have not necessarily led to action from the federal government. But potentially this time could be different. And certainly there are the anti-war protests and the civil rights protests did yield some results. I think that mass civil unrest, it's hard for me to cut a line of vision through that because there's a lot of it's almost like fog of war, but for protests instead of like an actual war. We'll see. Optimistically, something good might happen. Especially considering that you know, the other protests that I drew parallels to, you know, the the anti-war protests back in the 1970s and 60s, and the civil rights protests in the 50s and 60s were actually really unpopular while they were happening, and for a while after that as well. Whereas like these protests, the pro-Palestine protests, actually enjoy quite a large degree of public support. You know, people support the protesters. That's a pretty significant difference. So if anything, I feel like this would have more of an effect on public policymaking because of how much public support it enjoys. Um, but again, that turns it from just a we'll see to a maybe a bit more optimistic we'll see. You know, we'll see what happens. You know, originally, when I was thinking about talking about these protests, I was going to go through one of the Twitter accounts that has been pretty extensively covering it, but I don't know if that's possible. I honestly don't know if that's possible. The student protests are so widespread that, like I said, I legitimately could not name every university at which this is happening, even if I went looking for that specifically. And I'm also like not super interested in talking about the hen-pecking that liberals and conservatives are doing, because we know that they don't actually support the protests anyways. Yeah, what's up, 1v3? Um, so I guess just go protest. Shout outs to the students. Oh no, wait. There were a couple things that I wanted to mention. Uh, there have been some pretty extreme measures taken by the police. I mentioned the tear gas, the rubber bullets, and obviously the riot gear and all that. What can they even achieve? I'll get to that in a second. There have been some police departments that have deployed snipers on Ohio State campus. There are police snipers on the rooftops. And there is actually, for all of the huffing and puffing done by, like, liberal and conservative news media outlets, there have actually been no acts of violence committed by the students or instigated by the students at these protests. All of the violence that's being committed is on the part of the cops. You know, it's been cops beating up people, arresting people, removing tents and encampments and things like that. The students have actually been remarkably well behaved, considering it's a protest, which I don't think even matters all that much, because I would still defend them even if they were somewhat less disciplined. But to your point, globalize my agenda. What can they achieve? Actually, quite a bit. You know, the fact that protests are subject to this kind of police brutality is actually a massive optical asset, because it makes the protesters look sympathetic. When the police show up to protests like this and they start beating the shit out of the protesters, that's actually incredibly good for building public support for the movement. It's the same thing that writers do when they're writing movies. It's called kicking the dog or whatever. When there are people who are, you know, out doing something and they just get beat up for doing the thing that they're doing, that elicits sympathy. I mean, people tend to be pretty sympathetic towards somebody getting the crap beaten out of them. So as a result, the police being there is going to build public support more so than already exists, which is already pretty remarkable, for these protests. And that is going to put very, very real pressure on the United States government. Because at the end of the day, the officials in government that are at the wheel of policymaking depend on votes to be there. And, you know, there are enough people out there protesting that, like, they need to think about that from a perspective of getting those votes. You know, we've already seen lately the Democratic Party has actually taken something of a turn towards being more pro-Palestine. That's not to say that the whole Democratic Party is saying free Palestine, but there's been a significant tone shift away from the, like, completely uncritical support of the Israeli government and towards one of like advocating for a ceasefire. And that is because of movements like this. That's because of public support and popular pressure that gets put on governments, state, local, and federal. So directly, it's not it's not easy to achieve much in a mass movement like this. But when a movement is so massive, that actually increases the odds that you have support in civil offices at the levers of power already. So in that sense, something might happen, and there's definitely like an abstract sort of mounting pressure that a democratic government especially needs to think about. Because the state is primarily interested in not seeing civil unrest happen. And when civil unrest happens, they want to make it stop. So instinctively, what do? They send the cops. But I already talked about the Streisand effect. That only makes the civil unrest worse. So how do you stop the civil unrest, since the cops and other actors of the state are only making things worse? You capitulate to the demands of the protests. Historically, this has been how peaceful protest movements gain ground, is that through gaining sympathy, they gain power, and, the civil unrest balloons. And then with consistent demands, that puts more and more pressure on the state to, well, capitulate to those demands. So that's what they can achieve, potentially. Obviously, only time will tell. Could have butchered some of that explanation. But I think I got the major points right. If you ask a historian or like a political scientist how political movements work now and how they've worked historically, how peaceful movements get policy objectives passed, their answer would probably be somewhat similar to mine, if maybe more comprehensible. Since you ask, what is the news? Well, let's start with a bang. Let's start talking about the pro-Palestine protests. I talked a little bit about this last stream. And I think I am going to make a segment out of that. But there's actually more this time. There's more news to go over this time related to Palestine and the pro-Palestine protests specifically. Namely, they are no longer just student protests. Now, the majority of them still are, but there are beginning to be some pro-Palestine demonstrations that are not a part of a college campus. In fact, I can go to Al Jazeera here, because this is the only outlet I would probably trust to not give extremely slanted coverage. Al Jazeera had some good coverage of the pro-Palestine protests, which have now spread beyond college campuses and are now in certain like city centers, as well as being in other countries now. Primarily, the pro-Palestine protests were an American thing because, as we probably all know here, America is the strongest and most consistent supporter of Israel and the genocide that they are committing in Gaza. But, it's not like Europe has absolutely zero say. Pressure is pressure all the same, so. Next race. Al Jazeera, what do you got? Pro-Palestine student protests spread in second week of demonstrations. Large-scale demonstrations take place in the U.S. In U.S. universities and on European streets amid arrests and clashes with police. More of that Streisand effect. The police cracking down harder only makes the pro-Palestine sentiment spread further as a product of raised sympathy. In the second week of protests calling for a ceasefire in Israel's war on Gaza, which has killed more than 34,000 Palestinians, thousands of students are calling on dozens of universities to divest from Israel. This is an example of those very clear and consistent demands that are going to get the protesters a lot of ground, is that it's very simple, it's actionable in terms of policy, and it's relevant. A lot of universities in the United States, in fact, most universities in the United States, act like businesses. They have investments, they have financial portfolios and things like that because they're private institutions owned privately, run privately, and most of them on a semi-for-profit basis, in the sense that, like, even if they're not a quote-unquote for-profit entity, they are a privately owned enterprise that needs to make money to keep itself afloat. And part of that is certain investments with Israeli companies, and investments in the government of Israel, things like that. Agreements with Israeli universities, all sorts of financial investments like that. And the demand being made by the protesters is for these institutions to divest from all of those relationships with the state of Israel, because Israel is an apartheid state, is committing a genocide. And in fact, this is very similar to the demands made by anti-apartheid protesters in the 1980s, with regards to apartheid South Africa. You know, there's historical precedent for the kind of demands being set here. Not necessarily in terms of, I think, that you have to have that to justify it, but just in terms of it actually makes agenda setting a lot easier when there's somebody used the same tactics to agenda set for you, if that makes sense. So basically what I'm saying is that with the continued spread and existence of these protests, we're seeing this become more and more similar to the situation in the 20th century, late 20th century, regarding apartheid South Africa. Some universities have been forced to cancel their graduation ceremonies, while others have seen entire buildings occupied by protesting students. Yeah, that's right. I think, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, USC was one of the first universities to actually cancel the graduation ceremony for the students. And the reason they did so was not, mind you, because of any safety concerns. The protests have been incredibly peaceful. In fact, the only people committing violence at these protests have been the cops. I've seen no evidence to indicate otherwise. The main concern from universities that are canceling graduation ceremonies is that students will go up on the stage and say "Free Palestine" and basically turn the graduation event into another protest, which the universities don't want because they want the protests to stop. Here we go. One of the latest to join the movement is the City University of New York, abbreviated to CUNY, which I believe is pronounced CUNY, like Q and then the word "ni." Let's see, City University of New York, that's right. Hundreds of students have set up an encampment on campus with banners and slogans like "No more investment in apartheid." Gabi Aussie, a student organizer at the protests, told Al Jazeera the mobilization of young pro-Palestinian people in the U.S. is, quote, "beautiful to see." And I agree. I love to see that, actually. Especially because you know, it seems like the movement is primed to succeed in certain policy demands. Across the U.S., university leaders have tried and largely failed to quell the demonstrations. The police have intervened violently, with videos emerging from different states showing hundreds of students and even faculty members being forcefully arrested. I might show a couple examples of that, but it's very widespread, and it tends to look pretty samey. Police, hit somebody, tackle them, wrestle them to the ground, hold them down, and I don't know, flex cuff them, zip tie, whatever. Pretty standard police brutality stuff. Amazingly, I don't think anybody's died yet. And that's probably because of the publicity that these protests are getting. It's part of the Streisand effect. Early on Saturday, police in riot gear cleared an encampment on the campus of Northeastern University in Boston. Several dozen students shouted and booed at them from a distance, but the scene was otherwise not confrontational. The school said in a statement, I remember seeing this. The school said in a statement that the demonstration, which began 2 days ago, had become, quote, "infiltrated by professional organizers," unquote, with no affiliation to the school, and protesters has used anti-Semitic slurs. They did not, notably, provide an example of either of those things happening because they didn't happen. You can bet your ass that if either of those things were actually happening, the universities and the police and all sorts of right-wing affiliated media and actors would be clamoring, scrambling to post those video clips as fast as they can. But that didn't happen. Funnily enough, what has been happening is that people have come from off campus to support Israel and harass the pro-Palestinian protesters. As a matter of fact, there have been a couple video clips that show, Zionist activists getting pretty handsy and, shouting racial slurs. And if I show a video of that, which I hope I will not have the audio playing because, they would be saying racial slurs. So, a pretty blatant projection from the part of the university. And it's also, like, pretty disingenuous. They know that this isn't, like, actually what's happening. They just don't like what the student protesters have to say. And hey, the reason that they have to do this kind of rhetoric in the first place is actually pretty good for us because the protests enjoy a pretty large degree of public support, so they can't just attack the protests outright. They have to sort of come at it from this weird, oblique angle. Demonstrators reject the accusations of anti-Semitism, with many Jewish activists and some Orthodox Jews joining the ranks. That's pretty interesting. I didn't know Orthodox Jews were there. I knew that Jewish Voices for Peace was one of the biggest groups leading the protests here. We have a quote from somebody. As a child of Holocaust survivors, it disturbs me to see, to my core, to see my own people perpetrating something that we've been through. Jewish anti-war protester Sam Koprak told Al Jazeera at a campus gathering. Yeah. Here we go. The protests, which have sprouted all around the globe in the near 7-month period since the start of the war in Gaza, continue to spread this week outside the US as well. In Berlin, activists set up a camp in front of Parliament to demand the German government stop exporting arms to Israel. At the renowned Sciences Po University in the French capital, Paris, protesters on Friday blockaded a central campus building, forcing classes to be held online. The latest pro-Palestine rally in Sweden on Saturday saw people marching in the streets chanting Free Palestine and Boycott Israel, which is part of the boycott, divest, sanctions kind of demand. This is not the same kind of boycott as people on Twitter will often engage in, where they say that individually you should boycott X, Y, or Z company, because that doesn't really work. Companies nowadays are actually too big to be boycotted in that sort of way. But rather, you can boycott and divest and sanction certain countries or entities institutionally if you pressure the government to do so. So that's cool to see. People are gathering here on Parliament Square, just outside the Houses of Parliament, for the latest series of very major protests in the heart of London as well. This quote from somebody. No, damn it. No matter how well I'm driving, it's just not good enough. Although I didn't drive great that race because I was trying to read from the news at the same time. Let's see. Let's read the closing paragraph and then this will be it. It's a quote from Rina Shah, a Washington-based political strategist and former senior congressional aide. These students are out there concerned about America's role in backing Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu. On the one hand, we're supplying weapons and funds to do what he wants to do in Gaza, while on the other, we're sending humanitarian aid to Gaza. This is the hypocrisy that these students are concerned about. The hypocrisy isn't actually what the students are concerned about. Irrespective of hypocrisy, what students are concerned about is that the United States is supporting a genocide, and we should stop doing that. Hypocrisy need not necessarily apply there. It could be ethically consistent and people would still be up in arms like this. But people in Washington are very used to speaking in terms of civility politics, which means speaking in terms of hypocrisy. So if that's the support that they're prepared to give, then that's the support I'm prepared to take. Yeah. So based pro-Palestine protesters at it again, protesting in various different countries. And it seems that the movement is escalating in scope yet again. And again, this is sort of an optimistic we'll see moment where you know, it's not guaranteed or necessarily even super likely that something will happen, but it becomes more and more likely every time the protests grow somewhat larger and you know, retain such a unquestionably morally justified character.